Hey, this is Alex with Guys Can Read, and today's book report is just what the doctor ordered. We're talking about Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. Here's the table of contents. First, I'll give a more detailed summary of the book, and though there are spoilers here, I'm going to include them anyway, because what happens over the course of this book is basically a matter of public record now. Then, a few notes on the role of philanthropy to the Sacklers and why rich people don't donate to soup kitchens. Third, this story has been covered from a few angles over the last decade or so I'll give you a couple other places or works you can go check out if you want to learn more about this story. And finally, as always, some recommendations on who may and may not like Empire of Pain. But before we go any further, I'd love it if you could take a moment, like this video, and subscribe to the Guys Can Read channel on YouTube. Now, get ready. In this next part, you may feel a little bit of pain. Empire of Pain, byline Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty, is a deeply concerning, slightly maddening, and incredibly interesting read on the history of one of America's most covertly notorious families. Don't know who the Sacklers are? You're not alone. But you might know them by some of the products that made them rich, including Sacklers, Betadine, or OxyContin. And if you don't know what OxyContin is by now, stay tuned. Our book opens up in the year 2019 as Kathy Sackler, who's described as a reclusive billionaire, gives her deposition as part of a class action lawsuit. We come to learn that Kathy's family, the Sacklers, are philanthropists and have their name on charities and museums from coast to coast. Keefe, the author of Empire, shortly explains to us that the Sackler family has made the majority of their wealth from a company called Purdue Pharma, based in Connecticut. Many pharmaceutical companies are unimpressive or unrecognizable, but Purdue's claim to fame is the invention of the opioid painkiller named OxyContin. While it is known for being a blockbuster drug, OxyContin is better recognized as the start of the opioid crisis in America. And Keefe goes on to highlight, quote, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in the quarter century following the introduction of OxyContin, some 450,000 Americans had died of opioid-related overdoses. Such overdoses were now the leading cause of accidental death in America, account for more deaths than car accidents, more deaths even than that most quintessentially American of metric, gunshot wounds. In fact, more Americans had lost their lives from opioid overdoses than had died in all of the wars the country had fought since World War II. And it's worth noting that in a lot of occasions, the use of OxyContin has led some to end up using heroin and later fentanyl, though direct numbers for this connection are hard to pin down. This opening scene concludes with the attorney representing the class action, Paul Hanley, asking Kathy Sackler, quote, do you recognize that hundreds of thousands of Americans have become addicted to OxyContin? To which Kathy Sackler replies, I don't know the answer to that. We're then transported back in time to the start of Act 1 when Arthur Sackler is born in the year 1913. Arthur is sort of the patriarch of the Sackler family, the oldest of the three Sackler brothers. Arthur and his two brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, then go on to establish a name for themselves amidst the medical community as young professionals. Arthur, for example, goes to work for a medical advertising agency, William Douglas McAdams, and revolutionizes the art of advertising by pitching products or pharma not to the prescribees, the people taking medication, but to the prescribers, the doctors. He's then made president of William Douglas McAdams in the year 1944, 2 years after joining. One of his biggest clients is Pfizer, and with his work on terramycin, we kind of get introduced to the Arthur Sackler playbook for pushing product. Step 1. Use teasers to promote the arrival of a legendary new drug. Step 2. Sponsor studies by third parties who will demonstrate the drug's safety and efficacy on your behalf. And 3. Hire an army of sales reps to, quote, visit doctors in their offices armed with promotional literature and talk about the values of a drug. It is worth noting here, too, that with Pfizer and terramycin, Pfizer increased its sales force from 8 men to 300, and by 1957, they had 2,000 people working for their sales force. And this doesn't sit well with everybody. Charles May is a professor at Columbia Medical and is quoted by Keefe as asking, is the public likely to benefit if the practicing physicians and medical educators must perform their duties amidst the clamor and striving of merchants seeking to increase sales of drugs? A premonition of things to come, I'll close out the Act 1 Arthur Sackler section of the book by mentioning that Sackler had taken on Roche as a client, mainly to promote Librium and Valium, painkillers. When he did so, he guaranteed in his contract that he would receive escalating bonuses if both drugs, Librium and Valium, sold well. And spoiler alert, the drugs sold very well. Now we jump ahead to 1990. Arthur Sackler is passed, and his surviving brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, buy out Arthur's heirs from a pharmaceutical company that the three brothers had jointly purchased previously, called Purdue Frederick. Now, Purdue Frederick's most successful drug, MS-Contin, is approaching a patent cliff, after which the company is going to lose a lot of revenue because their patent's expiring. Anybody can make replicas of it, called generic versions. And MS-Contin, just so you have some background, has a continuous or slow release system, making it impossible to get addicted to the drug. Sure. And at this point, a Purdue Frederick employee named Bob Keiko, as well as Kathy Sackler, both approach Richard with an idea to incorporate OxyContin, which was invented in Germany in 1917 and could be used in conjunction with the Contin release system to create a new drug that Purdue could patent and sell. Quick note for those of you paying attention, OxyContin is twice as potent as morphine. But the Sacklers push on, determined by the fact that the 1 in 3 Americans living with chronic pain, or whatever invented statistic they came up with, needed this new medication. At least that's what they would later tell juries and courts. Incorporating a new business as Purdue Pharma, they eventually win approval from the FDA for OxyContin on December 28th, 1995, and at which point we are off to the races. The sales force, which is maybe Purdue's biggest asset, sets upon the U.S. like a plague. And it's weirdly reminiscent of the way that Pfizer's sales force for terramycin 4 decades earlier operated as well. Purdue reps love to use pre-scripted talk tracks. For example, OxyContin is the painkiller to start with and stay with, or fewer than 1% of patients who take OxyContin become addicted. And Purdue reps will also show up unannounced at the offices of busy physicians with takeout lunch, and Keefe actually notes a 2016 study that demonstrated that just one $20 lunch has the power to change the way that a doctor prescribes. And one final tool in the tool belt of Purdue reps, they end up using a market research firm called IMS, which was invented by Arthur Sackler and his friend Bill Froelich to target customers, looking at, quote, places where there were a lot of family physicians, where people had workers' comp, injuries they had sustained on the job, disabilities. And a quote from that same chapter later on. A doctor who wrote a lot of prescription painkillers was a priceless commodity. The sales reps referred to these doctors as whales. In so facto, Oxy takes over the country, especially in regions like the Rust Belt and impoverished communities in Appalachia, where local mining economies resulted in a number of chronic pain cases. But as overdose numbers climb and pharmacies are increasingly broken into, the United States realizes that it has a serious problem on its hands. The lawsuits against Purdue and the individual members of the Sackler family, who, by the way, weren't named in a suit until January 2019, are recent history, so I'm not going to do a summary here of the current state of litigation against the Sacklers, but if you want to see a video on that, get in the comments, let me know. Sam Quinones in his book Dreamland has also highlighted how the Mexican cartels took advantage of the situation created by the Sacklers in order to introduce heroin into the United States in bulk. Around 2010 is when Keefe says that the United States transitioned from a prescription painkiller epidemic to a heroin epidemic. More recently, I'd argue also that we've transitioned into a fentanyl epidemic, and I'd hope by this point you can see how fentanyl, OxyContin, and heroin are all related. The Sacklers in present day have all but severed ties with Purdue and actually made the move in 2018 to eliminate its sales force and state that it would, quote, no longer promote opioids to physicians. But despite having their names removed from university libraries and hospital wings and paying hundreds of millions in fines, the Sacklers have been very clever through the use of potential bankruptcy declarations and extracting cash disbursements from Purdue for the various family members. As such, it's left a lot of folks, including John Oliver, asking if the Sacklers have really paid for the damages done.
This might all sound like a major victory, that the Sacklers are finally experiencing significant consequences. But unfortunately, that could not be farther from the truth.
At this point, I will wrap the summary on Empire of Pain. One of the most interesting through lines of this book to me was the role that philanthropy played to the Sackler family. Because a lot of billionaires nowadays, Jeff Bezos, either don't give charitably or don't publicize it well. But in contrast, the Sacklers were everywhere from a charity perspective. Museums, hospitals, colleges, just to name a few. And if you're similarly curious to me, you're probably wondering at this point, okay, was all of this giving from the Sacklers truly altruistic? Or was there some ulterior motive behind it? By the end of the book, I found myself agreeing with Keefe that there absolutely was a motive behind all the giving. Let's unpack that. One example, in 1961, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, also known as the Met, approached Sackler to look for financing of $150,000 to install air conditioning prior to the World's Fair in New York, which would be held in 3 years. Arthur pledged a substantial fund of money, including earmarked funds for a renovation of the second floor, turning it into what would then become known as the Sackler Gallery. And Arthur pulled off a con job beyond even this. He purchased a series of Asian art pieces from the Met at the prices that the Met paid for them back in 1920. Now remember, this is 1961. Then Arthur donates these pieces back to the Met. And what exactly does that accomplish? Two things. First off, all of these pieces now have a gift from Arthur Sackler written on them, or their plaques in the Met. And on top of this, Sackler gets a tax write-off based on the donation back to the Met. But he doesn't get the tax write-off at the 1920s value, which is what he paid for them. He gets the tax write-off at the 1960s value. So he paid a small amount, based whatever the Met paid for them in 1920, and then gets the tax write-off at their 1960s value, which is probably much more significant. Smart move, Mr. Sackler. So the tax benefits are definitely one positive, but in my mind, the philanthropy was always a way for Arthur and the other members of the Sackler family to climb the ladder. There's no reason to want your name on everything other than recognition, the conceit kind of that powers that. And to showcase this beautifully, Arthur Sackler actually ended up giving a large portion of his collection to the Smithsonian Museum, not the Met, because he was denied a board seat at the Met despite having earned it, in his words. Keefe also points out that Arthur Sackler was competing at charity with the likes of the Rockefellers, heirs to the Standard Oil fortune, or the Lehmans, famously known for Lehman Brothers Bank. So in addition to the tax benefits, there was definitely ego at play here for Arthur and the rest of the Sacklers. One other possible explanation that Keefe makes, he does make a few mention that Arthur and his family were victims of some pretty serious anti-Semitism in the early and mid-20th century. And he further depicts that the Sacklers made a point at every company they founded to hire as many immigrants, including Jews, as possible. So there could have been a chip on at least Arthur's shoulder to succeed despite the era's anti-Semitism. Philanthropy among the excessively wealthy does have a funny stigma attached to it, because I think a lot of people react to these stories of billionaires and other rich people being charitable with like, okay, so what, you have $1 bazillion. And I think one of the reasons they react that way is due to a lot of the charities that these people are funding. In another book that I read this year, Billionaire Wilderness by Justin Farrell, Farrell points out that, for example, the billionaires of Teton County, Wyoming, give exclusively to nonprofits focused on art, like museums and art galleries, or nature. Contrast that with nonprofits that focus largely on human services like housing, food access, or employment. These, at least in Teton County, received virtually no donations from the billionaires that live there. So the fact that the Sacklers exclusively patronized museums and other buildings they could slap their name on doesn't surprise me in the least. Though it does make me a little bit sad that they're following the trend of philanthropy just for the purposes of establishing clout. Now, there's a lot to this story that I'm omitting in this video for purposes of brevity, but if you want to learn more about the drama of the Sackler family and the role they played in the opioid epidemic, let me provide you with a couple additional directions you can go in. First off, read the book, seriously. Empire of Pain is probably the best start-to-finish summary of the Sackler family. And as always, if you feel inclined to support, guys can read the affiliate link to our bookshop.org site where you can purchase Empire of Pain will be included in the video description. Don't buy the book from any major online retailer. You know the one I'm talking about. Because you're better than that. Or, if you hate this channel, go pick up the book at your local bookstore. Second, the first exposure that a lot of, at a minimum, my peers got to the opioid crisis was through the Hulu series Dopesick. Dopesick is a biopic similar to The Social Network. That is, it's a dramatized retelling of the rollout of OxyContin, its abuse in rural communities, and law enforcement's attempts to get justice for the countless addicted victims. The cast alone is awesome. Michael Keaton plays Dr. Samuel Phoenix, a local physician in a Virginia mining town who's seduced by the Sacklers but later ends up testifying against them. And Richard Sackler is played by Michael Stuhlbarg, who in the few episodes that I've seen does a really good job of portraying Richard Sackler as an absolute creep. This show is in turn based on the book Dopesick by Beth Macy, which I will also link in the description. And anecdotally, I've heard the book is very good, but I haven't had a chance to read it myself. Third, God bless YouTube. In researching for this video, I turned up a bunch of videos on the Sacklers and their role in the opioid crisis. John Oliver on HBO's Last Week Tonight has a 4-part series on opioids, the second of which is actually referenced by Patrick Radden Keefe in Empire of Pain. And the channel Cold Fusion has a 20-minute documentary type video that's been viewed more than 3.8 million times, which basically details the role of the Sacklers in the opioid epidemic. I will link that video as well. And one more that I literally found as I was researching for this video. Matthew Broderick starred as Richard Sackler in a miniseries on Netflix called Painkiller, similar to Hulu's Dopesick. Just from the trailer, this looks a little more goofy compared to Dopesick. I don't know if I'm into it, and to be honest, it's not doing so hot on Rotten Tomatoes, so go and watch at your own risk. Pete Berg, the director of Painkillers, did do Joe Rogan's podcast a while back to promote it, and the comment section on this YouTube clip that I found has some people sharing really nasty experiences of either themselves or loved ones who got addicted to OxyContin at some point. As far as recommendations go, this is a fascinating story, and one that I think everybody should be at least familiar with, even if they don't read the book. That said, I really like this book, and I would recommend it. Specifically, if you're into the genre of business malfeasance stories, you will enjoy this book. Empire of Pain is for fans of Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, The Accidental Billionaires by Ben Mesrich, or the subsequent movie The Social Network about Facebook, or The Big Short by Michael Lewis and the movie that was made off of that book. And if you are currently or were previously a business major, I would definitely suggest checking out this book. A, because it's a great study of what not to do in business ethics, but B, just because it's a fascinating business saga and a demonstration of how the court of public opinion is basically always a stakeholder at the end of the day. As far as who shouldn't read this book, this is another long book. It's 440 pages, which can get dry at times, and if you don't have the stomach for that, I'd recommend sitting this one out. Keefe recounts every affair, every divorce, every major philanthropic contribution made by the Sacklers, and each of their steps commercially to obtain success. And those pages do add up after a while. And as usual, if you are not a nonfiction person, I don't think this is the book to try and start to get into the genre. And with that, I'll conclude today's book report on Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. Where do you go from here? Well, for starters, I'd love it if you could like this video and subscribe to the Guys Can Read channel on YouTube. It helps out the channel and tells me that I'm not yelling about books into the void. Then, if you think that talking about this book or others with a group of guys nationwide sounds cool, you are in luck. Use the Google form linked in the description to sign up for the Guys Can Read mailing list and or join a live, in-person book club discussion in your city. And finally, if you find yourself wanting to read the book reviewed in this video, go and check out the video description for a link to the Guys Can Read page on bookshop.org. We are an affiliate partner and receive a small percentage of revenue from book sales through our shop on the site. That's all, but thanks again, and see you next time.